The other day, I happened to be jumping around inside a Claude, and if you take a look, there is something that they refer to as an output style. And when you click into this, you can switch between different styles. There's a default style, there's an explanatory style, a learning style, and then you can actually create your own styles. So this sort of sparked my interest. I've been looking for something that is like this. And so I had a chance to sort of dive in and learn a little bit about what output styles are all about, in fact. And so here's an example of what would happen, right? If I, for example, were to change over to, in this instance, like the explanatory output style. So what happens in those cases is as you're doing work here, for example, right? Like I was asking, hey, like maybe I need to add some animations to this project. It goes and adds this extra little call out there as you were talking with Claude, and sort of explains a little bit about like what would the best decision may be. And so you can customize this. There's other ways to sort of try to have Claude do this, but output styles are a little bit of a unique way to do it, considering say how they work. Here's another example of another output style that I myself had created. And so this one I made, and it's overly friendly. And so I have it just be extra, extra friendly. And so when it's talking back to me, it's using emojis and exclamation points and just saying, oh, I can see you have a lovely tic-tac-toe game. So you can get a sense of like what is happening a little bit here with what the output can sort of be crafted or sort of morphed into. You can go to an extreme and do sort of other crazy stuff too. But before we do something like that, let's take a look a little bit about like output styles themselves. And I'll actually go and bring this over because I think this is a good way to explain what's going on here. And so like inside of Claude Code, you of course have the system prompt, right? And that is a set of instructions that Claude or Anthropic has provided to Claude Code. And that is, largely for the most part, say like hidden or sort of proprietary, and it's more or less guarded, right? Like when you go and ask Claude Code, hey, what's your system instructions? It's not going to just sort of share it with you. Now, sometimes on occasion those leak, but that aside, the system prompt is a particularly powerful thing if you can sort of get access to it. And one part of the system prompt inside of, or one part of system prompts is the actual output style. And so Claude Code, that is, has a default output style. And that output style has, pretty much, something that, I think Claude or, Anthropic generally would sort of say is like the starting point for everything. But they, inside of their docs, for example, say that it has instructions to be specifically explicit. It also has certain instructions to sort of tune Claude Code even more so for the programming use cases. And we'll get a little bit more into that too. But like that's the way it starts. That's the default setting. Now you can of course change that to be, for example, this explanatory. And this is the actual prompt for explanatory. Anthropic has actually sort of put this out on the internet. It happens to live inside of a plugin, and you can sort of use output styles either as a plugin or as a native feature inside of Claude. We'll get to that here in a second, but you can get a sense of like what's being injected inside of the system prompt here. And so you can, again, sort of craft this and get clever with it. And so, like I said, there's a default. There is these other built-in versions, and then you can customize a output style in your own way. And a little bit before we go into that is I went and dove pretty deep a little and sort of figuring out how this actually all works. And like I mentioned, there is this native implementation of output styles, and then there's actually this plugin based version. At one point, the native implementation was expected to be deprecated. But in fact, based upon some feedback, they chose to actually not deprecate it. It was being deprecated in favor of the plugin-based version, but there's enough feedback for it to sort of actually stick around as a native feature inside of Claude Code. But what I'm trying to get at here through this picture is that you, of course, have your context window. And inside of that context window, you have a bunch of stuff that is loaded in before you start any conversation inside of that chat session. So system prompt, you've got your Claude MD, you've got other stuff like MCPs, tools, skills, other things, right? One of those things that would get injected inside of the system prompt is this output style context block, as I'm referring to it here. And there's also sort of other, Claude in its own docs goes and sort of describes how, the output style is sort of done in a little bit of a different way than some of the other pieces of context that you are, feeding into Claude Code as it does its work. And so they contrast it to Claude.md. So Claude.md is also preloaded into, the context window when you start a new session, but it is not part of the system prompt necessarily. Whereas the output style context block, as I'm referring to it here, this is my own like little lingo, is part of the system prompt. It is actually added to it. You also can use this other flag and append system prompt, which sort of adds to the system prompt, the base, say, set of content that's included there, but that's appending to it. It is not actually sort of altering the existing system prompt, or at least the context they're in. So you can sort of add extra detail to it, but you can't sort of swap out detail. Whereas inside of this, the output style context block, that is what you're doing using the native implementation of output styles. And then, of course, you have the rest of your conversation where you're chatting back and forth between Claude Code and it's doing a bunch of work. So that's the way that it's actually implemented. That contrasts with this, say, plugin-based implementation. This is the implementation that they were looking to move toward. And this is done a little bit differently. It's injected through a hook, the session start hook, which is an interesting hook to sort of be able to tie into generally. And you could sort of, again, mimic some of what's happening with output styles, no shocker, through a session start. That's probably why Anthropic picked this sort of alternate method to do this or have this effect. But what's happening there is, again, inside your context window, you got your system prompt, and you might still, again, use that one extra flag where you are appending the system prompt. That still might exist here. Claude.md might also be loaded inside of your context window, but again, not as a part of the system prompt. Same story with MCP, skills, other things. The output style context block is added to context when you start a session through the hook, through the start session hook. So that is done a little bit in a different way. It's added to context in a little bit of a different way than the native version. And this actually is why the feedback came back to Anthropic to potentially, or to sort of leave in the native implementation. And the reason being is that when you add context, say outside of the system prompt, there's the potential for that particular guidance or, rule or whatever context it might be to sort of get drowned out over time. Whereas if it's inside of the system prompt, it's going to have a heavier weight to it. And so that's one of the reasons why, the feedback sort of came in so strong to keep output styles in as a native sort of feature, where the movement was toward a plugin-based implementation. Both of them still exist, and in fact, that's where I get the prompt here, right? Like if you go to the plugin itself there on GitHub, you can take a look at what these actually say. And so this is, the actual prompt that powers, in this instance, the learning output style. So you can get a little bit of a feel for what, Claude is, provided out of the box. The one other topic to cover is like, well, what if you want to go and build your own? And so similar to a lot of stuff inside of Claude or inside of Claude Code, you're going to be able to put this in a particular part of your project, which is going to then sort of determine where it's going to be able to be accessed. So you can do this at either a project level or at a user level. You're going to build a markdown file that's going to have front matter to it. And so it's going to have a name, a description, and then it actually has this extra, piece of information called keep coding instructions. By default, anytime any of the output styles that Claude Code has built in, these are all set to true. You can, however, set this to false. So when it is set to true, as an example, it's extra content or context is being injected to say stuff like, when you're going to be, modifying code, verify that stuff with tests. That's, straight from the Claude Code docs. So there's some extra detail that's injected to the output style when this is true. You can, however, also turn this off. So you can turn it off and say false. So this is at least, said to be one way to pretty much alter Claude Code to be more of a general use style tool. It's not necessarily so focused on coding. And if you ask me, this seems a whole lot like, what came out just the other day, Cowork, which is, by its own sort of branding, the Claude Code for everybody else. And so you might sort of think that, hey, maybe this is sort of one of the ways, or at least one of the knobs that they turned in order to make something like this happen. So it's not so focused on coding, is they pretty much turned this off. They turned it off false, and then obviously gave it its own UI. And then you, of course, also have the prompt. And you saw an example of that just earlier. This can be your own, and it can include whatever information you want to with it. And so, this is an example provided through, the Claude Code docs. Is in this instance, you're going to have that front matter, my custom style, a description for whatever it might be. That's what you're going to see inside of the Claude Code terminal. And then the instructions themselves. You will notice that one extra parameter, the keep coding instructions parameter, not there. That's again because by default it is true. So unless you're really just going to add that only when you're going to say turn it off. So let's play around with these a little bit, and I'll again sort of walk you through some of this. This is actually the thing that sort of caught my eye, is this little call out that is added. I've been trying to think of a way to pretty much have Claude Code be, say, self-aware, where it is understanding potentially ways that it could improve and remove friction for the future. So you might have had this instance where you are, implementing some particular feature, and you are directing Claude Code to do something very specific, something, let's say a convention that you want to have followed. And in a perfect world, all that stuff that sort of sits inside of your head would already be inside of your claude.md file or some other place in memory with Claude, but that's not always the case. And you might want a little hint or a little notification or a little heads up that maybe this is a good time to add something there, because you've pretty much, crafted a message, or sort of had a conversation that suggests anyway that that's something that you do want to have done. And so that's actually this custom output style that I've chosen to build here. And so if you take a look at this inside of my output styles, I've got the self-improvement output style. And you'll see here what I'm trying to do is I'm saying, hey, whenever you're helping with tasks, you're trying to pretty much coach the user to potentially tap different features inside of Claude Code to make, say, their experience a little bit better in the future. And so I've got this whole little bit about hey, when you see this happen, try to suggest that you might want to add something to Claude Code or Claude.md, something like that. So let's have some fun, and let's turn into self-improvement mode. And let's say that we want to, let's implement a component that cycles through emojis on the main page. Be sure to put that in a components folder. That is where all components in this project should live. And so this might be a normal thing that you're choosing to add, and do inside of your own project. I've sort of said this in a way that it sort of sounds a little casual. This is at least one way I talk to Claude, and it's going to pick up on the fact that I've said, be sure to put that inside of a components folder, and that this is where all the components inside of this project should be living. So of course it's going to build that little component real fast. Bada bing, bada boom. And then as soon as that wraps up, and look, we can take a look at it. Sure enough, there's a little emoji, and then it's produced this, an insight. You mentioned that components should live in the components folder. Add this to a claude.md file so I can always remember, and then sort of gives me some suggestion text. This is what I've been trying to do more of, is pretty much have Claude sort of be thinking about the conversation that I'm having with it, and then actually give me suggestions on how to, say, remove this friction that we're having there in the moment, so that it doesn't happen again in the future, or sort of head off some of the stuff that you might see in the future. So this, has been a super interesting, say, feature to tap into. You could potentially, use the start session hook in order to do something similar. But I found it interesting that you can actually just tap into output styles and pretty much do this. So if you're ever interested in, I'm actually thinking about building a whole plugin that is all about self-improvement, that pretty much does this style stuff, like injects notifications or call outs when this is a learning moment that Claude either can have for itself, or moreover just a bigger system, so that as you're doing your work, Claude is learning on its own, as opposed to you having to sort of stop and pause and always be going back into any piece of the Claude memory system in order to add the right detail in the right place. So if you're interested in seeing what I come with there, put a comment down below. But I hope you got some information out of this and learned a little bit about output styles.